pray that you would continue to make that truth more and more real to us. That we would know that we are never outside of where you can see us. You are closer than the very breath that we breathe. God, may we become aware daily, hourly, moment by moment of your abiding presence. May we rely on you and trust you, not turning to our own understanding, but seeking you. We want you to be glorified. We want you to be lifted up. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord. Amen. You may be seated. Well, this morning I want to share with you a story that is one of my favorite ones from the Bible, but because of just how much impact that this story has. But let me tell you why this story is unique and why I think that it fits well in the setting in which we live. Those of us who are followers of God, those of us who believe in God, those of us who want to obey what God has laid out for us, are going to continually run into opposition. And there is, at times, for some people, there's a cop-out answer when somebody says, why do you behave like that? Or why don't you go along with what we're doing? That we just say, well, because the Bible says so, or because this is what God said, and we kind of throw it back on God. But here's why this story that I want to share with you today is unique. It's a story of God followers, people who are passionately in love with God and passionately want to follow His ways. And yet throughout this entire story, the name of God is not mentioned one time. Not once does God's name show up in this story. Now that's very telling to me for a couple of different reasons. One is, that means that, to put it in kind of our modern terminology, you can be a Christian without telling people that you're a Christian. And it's also important, I mean, I think we know this, but I think it's a good reminder at times to say that we know that God is at work, even if we don't say, hey, there's God working on something. Hey, here's God doing this. We don't necessarily see His fingerprints on it. Doesn't mean that He's not actually working there. We know that He's working. And so this story is fascinating to me because looking at it through the lens of New Testament Christians, we can look back on it and say, oh, I see God's fingerprints all over this story. And yet, the divinely inspired writer, as he penned this story down, and the Holy Spirit moved on his heart to write this down, never once moved his heart to write Jehovah. Never once to say, well, here was the prayer that they prayed to God, or here's what they did. Now, you can see it all throughout the story, but I think that it's very telling that this is how God laid it on this man's heart to write this story out. The story takes place in the city of Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire at this time. It used to be the Babylonian Empire until the Persians came in and overthrew them. Now, it's recorded for us in the book of Esther in the Bible. Now, chronologically, Esther would fit in between, in the book of Ezra, which comes 2 books before that, it would fit in between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. Okay, that's kind of where you get the timeline. So if you're reading your Bible, you would read Ezra, Nehemiah, and then you'd read Esther. But Esther really that story kind of gets inserted back there. And where the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah are mostly taking place in Jerusalem or surrounding the events that are taking place in Jerusalem, this one completely takes place inside of this foreign capital of Susa, where the Jews have been taken away as captives and held there. Now, if you're reading in, depending on which translation of the Bible you're reading, the king of Persia, has two different names. His Greek name or Persian name is Xerxes, and his Hebrew name, so some translations of the Bible will have this in there, is Ahasuerus. Okay, I'm going to just use the name Xerxes as I tell this story. So if you're following along in your Bible and you see Ahasuerus, we're talking about the same person, just different languages that we have there. Xerxes put on a party. This party lasted for 6 months. It was really kind of a giant open house. He invited people from the 127 provinces that he covered. So he basically went from what today would be kind of modern day Iran and Iraq all the way over to the Mediterranean Ocean. That is the whole territory of his kingdom. It was massive. And so for some people, it might take them 4 months to travel to get to Susa. And so when he had this open house, he couldn't just say, hey, everybody show up on this day or this week. So he had a 6-month-long open house. And this whole open house was just for Xerxes to brag. Look at how much I've got. Look at all my treasures. Look at all my wealth. And he culminated 6 months of an open house with a 7-day-long party. Now let me tell you how rich Xerxes was from conquering all the lands that he did. You can imagine by the time that you get 6 months into your celebration, there's a lot of people that stuck around. There's a lot of people at this party, and yet the writer, Esther, records that not one person was drinking out of the same gold goblet. There was enough unique golden goblets there that everybody was drinking their wine out of their own individualized goblet. And the story is that the wine flowed freely. And near the end of 7 days of this party that Xerxes is throwing, and he says, you know, I've shown off my kingdom and all my treasures, and people are holding these goblets. They got to know how rich I am. But there's one thing that I haven't shown them, and that is this beautiful bride that I have. I want to bring in Queen Vashti to show her off. And frankly, I want to make a lot of these guys here jealous of the woman that I have. And so he got his servants around him and said, go get Queen Vashti, tell her to put on her nicest gown, and get her over here. I want to parade her in front of everybody, and I want them to be jealous of me. And so they went, as she was throwing her own party with the women of the kingdom, and they said, hey, the king wants you to come stretch your stuff in front of everybody. And she goes, no. He's drunk. He just wants a bunch of slobbering drunks to ogle me while I'm standing, and I'm not going to do that. That's degrading. I'm not going to do it. Servants came back, and they had to sheepishly come in and say to the king, she said no, and his temper just went off the chart. The party ended. He calls in his advisors and said, this is humiliating. This is embarrassing. What am I going to do about this? One of his advisors, a man by the name of Memucan, stood up and spoke for the rest of them. And he said, you know, Your Majesty, it's actually worse than what you're thinking. It's not just you who've been humiliated, but I'm starting to hear these reports all around the city and farther out into the countryside where husbands are asking their wives to do things, and the wives are saying, hey, if the queen didn't even obey the king, then why do I have to obey you? So he said, Your Majesty, if we don't come down hard on this, this is going to be an uprising. I mean, women are going to start telling men everywhere what they can and can't do. Can't have that, right? So the king says, all right, Memucan, what's your suggestion? What's your counsel that we do here? And he says, well, at a minimum, you got to divorce her, but then depose her from the kingdom. She's got to be out of here. Don't even, that way all of the other guys can say, okay, woman, you think you're going to act up like this? I'm going to do the same thing to you that the king did to Queen Vashti. That'll put it down. The king says, all right, sounds like a good plan. That's what they did. They got rid of Vashti. But after the king's anger came down a little bit, he said, you know, I'm kind of lonely. I liked having my bride around. I'd like to replace, maybe I could bring her back. And they said, no, let's not bring her back. Let's find somebody else for you. Have you seen how big your kingdom is? We're going to send out an edict that every unmarried woman, they're going to come and you're going to have your pick of the best throughout the whole kingdom. And so this edict goes out throughout the kingdom. Now there was living in Susa a man by the name of Mordecai. He was a Jew. He had a cousin named Hadassah. Hadassah's parents, though, had died while Hadassah was still quite young. And so Mordecai adopted her and really raised her as his own daughter. Hadassah was her Jewish name, but to kind of protect her a little bit, he gave her a Persian name, the name of Esther. She at first was reluctant. I'm not sure that I want to go and be, just on parade, part of this beauty pageant for the king. And he says, no, you've got to do it. We can't break the law, can't disobey the king. You need to do this. Esther showed up at the palace, and now you can imagine that the story is that they were going to go through a year long of beauty treatments. And they were going to be fitted for the best gowns before they ever went to see the king. Now, I'm sure everybody has seen a beauty pageant, and you've probably seen some behind-the-scenes conversations. These are not, for the most part, people that are in these pageants are not usually the quiet wallflowers, right? I mean, they want to get noticed. And so now, not only do they want to get noticed and have the potential of being the queen, but they're not paying for any of this. This is all coming out of the king's treasury. He's going, I'm going to give you all these beauty treatments. You're going to get this massive makeover, new hairstyle, new makeup, whatever perfume you want, whatever clothes you want. But Esther stood out among all of the other women to this guy named Haggai that oversaw this whole process, because she didn't push for what she wanted. She constantly deferred to him. He said, what do you want? She says, well, I don't know. You know better than anybody else. I'll defer to your judgment. What clothes do you think I should wear? What beauty treatment do you think that I should have? And the story tells us that Haggai took notice of that and said, you know what? There's something special about you. So he actually gave her her own entourage, her own set of maids to take care of her. And when her time came for her to go before the king, she did what she had always done in that year that she had been there with Haggai. She said, tomorrow's my turn with the king. You know what he likes, and you know what looks good on me. What do you think I should wear? And Haggai said, no, do you understand, Esther, that you could pick all of these clothes, take as much as you want, and if the king doesn't select you, and you're going to go home with a whole new wardrobe at the king's expense. She said, no, it's okay. Just what you pick out for me. And Haggai must have known what he was talking about, because Esther caught the king's attention unlike any of the other women that had been there. And he crowned her king or queen to serve alongside of him in Vashti's place. And the whole city of Susa breaks into a party. They were won over by her as well. Shortly after becoming queen, her guardian Mordecai, he worked as a kind of a porter at the gate to the palace. One day while he was sitting there working, he overheard a plot being hatched by a couple of guards that were on the inner circle. They were part of what we'd call today like the Secret Service, the bodyguards of the king. And he overheard them hatching a plot to assassinate the king. And so Mordecai got a message to Esther and said, you need to let the king know. And she got the message to the king, and the king got some of his trusted advisors to investigate and found out that the plot was true. And those two guys were hanged for their offense against the king. During this time, there was another man that was climbing the ladder. His name was Haman. He just kept getting elevated. He was on the fast track. The king Haman caught the king's eye, and he just said, hey, you've got some promise, you got some potential, and kept raising him up until this guy became second in command in the kingdom. He was full of himself. Every time that you read about Haman talking about himself, he's like, hey, did you guys notice how rich I am? Do you see my sons? Look at what strong, strapping young men that I have here. And hey, look at my wife. She's kind of a hottie too. And hey, check me out. I mean, I got all these new clothes for my position. I'm second in command in the kingdom. The king trusts me with all this stuff. I'm pretty hot stuff. And so because of that, because he thought of himself so highly, he wanted everybody else to think of him the same way. And so he got a law passed that whenever he came by, people had to bow down to him like they would bow down to the king. And so Mordecai's working at the gate, and every day as Haman would come in and out, everybody would bow down, and Mordecai would just stand there. And his other friends, that are kneeling down, I'm sure they're like, get down, get down. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. And they said, well, why not? His simple answer was this: I'm a Jew. That was it. So they said, really, we're going to see how long this stands. They got a message to Haman. They said, hey, Haman, I don't know if you've noticed or not. When you're coming in and out of the gate, look over to your left. There's one guy that's not going to bow down. Haman finally took notice. Looked over, saw Mordecai standing there while everybody else bowed down. And he began to burn with anger. How dare he insult me like this? And so he said, hey, what's the deal? Why won't he bow down? I said, well, he says he's a Jew. He goes, oh, is that right? I'm going to take care of this. So he goes in before the king and he says, Your Majesty, I don't know if you know this or not, but in your territory that you've conquered, there's a group of people that they just openly flaunt your laws. They just disregard, they pick and choose which one of your laws that they want to follow. And if we don't squash this pretty quickly, there's going to be a rebellion that is going to just start fomenting in the kingdom, and it's going to gain steam. You could have a civil war on your hand. The king says, well, what do you propose that we do? And he says, well, we need to wipe them out. We need to get rid of them. So the king says, okay, I'll tell you what. Took a signet ring off of his hand. The ring that sealed all official laws of the Medes and Persians. And he gave it to Haman. He said, you write the law as you see best, seal it with my ring, and make it happen. Haman got together with his advisors, and they're like, okay, we're going to wipe out the Jews on a particular day. How do we know what day to pick? So they pulled out some dice, and they threw the dice, and the dice came up with the month of Adar, the 13th day. Haman was a little disappointed because they're only in, like, to use our terminology, they were in January, and Adar would have been like December. Have almost a whole year to go. So every day, Haman's got to come in and out of that palace and look over there and see Mordecai standing there. He says, I got to put up with this for a whole nother year? And he's burning. Well, soon as the law comes out and the couriers get on horses to spread it to the whole kingdom and pass and let everybody know what this law is. There's an interesting phrase in the story. It says that after the law went out, the king and Haman went to dinner, and it says, but the city of Susa was perplexed. People heard the law and they're like, what in the world? Again, remember, this culture is one that they had multiple gods that they worshipped, multiple idols that they bowed down to. And so now they're going, okay, so they're picking on the Jews for worshiping this one God. What happens if all of a sudden the God that I worship becomes kind of out of vogue? Is another law going to come out and I'm going to be, what's going to happen here? So the city is perplexed. They're going about their party, but Mordecai, as a sign of mourning, he takes his robes and he rips them apart so they're just tatters on him. And he takes dust and ashes and drops it on his head and just walks through the town wailing over the fate of his people that is hanging above them. Esther hears about it through one of her bodyguards named Hatak. And so she says, here's some clean clothes. He can't come into the palace dressed like that. Take these clean clothes to him and bring him in here so I can talk to him. Hatak goes out there and says, here, the queen wants you to put this on. And he says, I'm not going to put on those clothes. He said, I want you to tell her, she may not have even heard, but here's the law that's been passed. Here's a copy of it. Here's what's going down. Hatak, a guard in the palace, even was surprised. He didn't even know what was in the law. Went back and explained to Esther and said, Esther, here's what's going on. And Mordecai wants you to go and make an appeal to the king. She said, I can't. It's against the law. For anybody to walk into the king's presence that hasn't been summoned, it's immediate death unless the king overrides that. And I hardly ever get called into his presence. I'm not going to be able to do this. And I love as Hatak takes the message back to Mordecai, I love Mordecai's words. He says, if you don't speak out at this time, here's what's going to happen. You're going to lose your life. But deliverance for the Jews is going to come from somewhere else. And then he says this to her. Who knows? Who knows that you haven't come to this royal position for such a time as this? So Esther says, fine. Tell Mordecai to go get all of the Jews and fast for me for the next 3 days. I'm going to fast as well. And at the end of 3 days, I'm going to go talk to the king. I'm going to walk into his presence unannounced. And if I die, I die. 3 days went by. She put on her best gowns. her royal robe. And as she's walking to the king's courtroom, she very well could have been thinking, this is my death march. I could walk into the king's courtroom, and what's going to happen when I step in there unannounced is immediately these bodyguards are going to throw a bag over my head, and they're going to hold a sword to my throat. And unless the king issues a last-second pardon, they're going to slit my throat, and I'll be dead. But she walked into the king's courtroom, and immediately when he saw her, he was happy. And he took the guards were poised and ready, but he held his scepter out to her. And she came up and knelt before him, and he says, Queen Esther, I'm glad to see you. What do you want? I'll give you up to half my kingdom if you ask for it. She says, you know, all I would like is for you and Haman to come to a dinner that I've planned for tonight. He said, go get Haman, we're coming right now. They go to her house and they eat, and she puts on a great spread for them. The king is a wise man. He says to her, Esther, I know that you didn't risk death coming into my courtroom just to invite me to come to dinner. You could have sent a messenger to do that. I know you've got something on your mind. What is your request? I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom. And she says, you know what I'd like, Your Majesty? I'd like you and Haman to come back to dinner again tomorrow night. And at that time, I'll tell you what my request is. They leave there, and Haman is just popping his buttons. He goes home and he tells his wife and all his friends, he goes, check me out. He said, nobody got invited to the queen's banquet except for me and the king. I mean, I am all of that. Now, there might have been something wrong with Esther's cooking, because that night, the king couldn't sleep. He's tossing and turning. Finally, he asked for one of his scribes. He says, would you open up the book that just records all of the things, let's just start reading to me. It's going to put me to sleep, because, it recorded the daily activities of the king. So some of the stuff was really boring. You had an ambassador that came from Egypt, and you guys talked about this. And then, you had to make a decision about the crops. And it's just really kind of boring stuff. Even that didn't work on the king. He just kept wide awake. Finally, as they're reading through this, they come to the story about where Mordecai had uncovered the plot of Bigthan and Teresh to assassinate the king. And they get done with that story, and the scribe turns the page, and it's going to start on the next account. And the king goes, whoa, hold on a second. Back up. He goes, I think you missed a part. No, Your Majesty, I read it all. And he goes, no, what did we do for Mordecai? I mean, he saved my life, and there's no record in there. He says, no, there's no record in here. He goes, then we must have overlooked something. Right at that moment, he hears a noise out in the courtyard, and he says, hey, go find out who's out in the courtyard. Standing out in the courtyard is Haman. Haman, coming home from that thing and popping his buttons. He said, you know what? It's great having all this stuff, but I had to walk out of the queen's palace and see that doggone Mordecai standing right there again, just thumbing his nose at me. And his wife says to him, you know what? Listen, your popularity is never going to be higher. Your stock is never going to go any higher with the king. If you just go ask the king to hang Mordecai, just be done with him. He says, I like that plan. So, he got so excited about this, he had a hard time sleeping too. He rounded up some carpenters, and they built a gallows in his own yard to hang Mordecai. But not just any gallows. He built it 75 feet tall. He wanted to make sure that everybody for blocks around could see that guy hanging there and say, see, you disrespect me, that's what's going to happen to you. So he's so excited, he's standing out there in the inner court just waiting for the king to be up and ready. And he knows he's going to go in there and ask the king, hey, I want this guy's head. And he's going to go, yeah, whatever, he's bugging you. What's he to me? So he walks in there, and the king goes, Haman, I am so glad you're here. I need your advice on something. Haman's going, all right. Here we go again. He says, what should be done for the man that the king delights to honor? And the story records there that Haman thought in his own mind, he goes, who else would the king want to honor but me? So he says, oh, I know what you should do. Get one of your royal robes that you've worn and put that on the man you want to honor. And then get one of the king's horses that has the king's crest on it and put that guy on the horse wearing your robe. And then take one of your princes and have them lead that horse through the city streets all over Susa and say, this is what will be done for the man that the king delights to honor. And the king says, great! Haman, you do that for Mordecai. He's got to obey the king. Can you imagine walking through the city with this guy that you were just minutes before going to ask the king if I could kill this guy? And you're going, this is what's going to be done for the man that the king delights to honor. After he winds all the way through the city streets and comes back to the palace, the story says that Mordecai just went right back to his job, and Haman goes home furious and embarrassed. He barely gets home, and the servants are there knocking on the door going, Haman, it's time for you to go back to the queen's banquet with the king. Go back to the banquet. You can imagine Haman's a little preoccupied at this time. He's a little still, these thoughts swirling around. This time the king doesn't even wait until they finish the dinner before he says to Esther, okay, Esther, you put your life on the line. You gave us dinner yesterday. You gave us dinner today. I can't wait anymore. I know that you want something. What is your request? I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom. And she says, I have a request that you would spare my life and the life of my people. She said, you know, if we had been sold just as slaves, I would have kept quiet about it. We would have just gone with it. But the fact that we've been sold out to be killed, I have to speak up. The king's anger begins to boil, and he says, I've not heard about that. Who would ever presume to do such a thing? And she pointed her finger across the table and said, this wicked Haman. The king overturns his table and storms out of the room to walk in the garden. Haman knows he's in hot water. He is pleading with the queen. I had no idea. Your name is Esther. That's a Persian name. That's not a Jewish name. I had no idea that he is pleading with her. And in his pleading and sobbing, he falls across her lap as he's pleading, just as the king walks back in and thunders. He says, will you even molest the queen while I'm standing here? When the guards heard that, immediately the bag went over his head and they had the sword poised next to his throat. One of the servants that had gone to summon Haman from his house said, Your Majesty, when I went to pick up Haman, there's this gallows built in his yard, 75 feet tall. And I did a little checking and I found out, you know that guy Mordecai that saved your life? Haman had those gallows built for him. The king pointed at his guards, pointed at Haman and said, hang him on those gallows. Now that was good, I guess, that Haman was gone, but this problem hadn't been solved yet. The queen continues to plead with the king and says, well, okay, Haman's gone, but in the 12th month, on the 13th day, my people are going to be gone too. Is there anything you can do about that? And he said, you know, once a law has been passed, it's set in stone. You can't write another law. Can't just cancel that one out and say, forget about that one. We're going to have to do something totally different. Esther said, I think Mordecai might have an answer for it. And once again, the king, now I think he'd be a little gun shy after what Haman just did to him, but the king took off his signet ring and gave it to Mordecai and said, Mordecai, try to undo this mess that Haman's created for us. He said, frankly, it's embarrassing to me too. I mean, I look bad. And so here's the brilliant plan that Mordecai came up with. Now, he can't just say, forget about the law, but instead what he says is on the 12th month, the 13th day, anybody who's a Jew can arm themselves. And if somebody attacks you, you get to fight back. And if you win, you get to take all of their possessions. Now, you can imagine that that's going to be a little bit of a deterrent. It's a lot easier to just go kill somebody in their house when they're not armed and they're not fighting back at all. And so when that day came, there were still a couple of brave people that thought that they would try to attack the Jews, but the Jews fought back and they won in all of their battles. And then the king said to Mordecai, thanks for bailing me out of this situation. Thanks for getting me off the hook here. And brought him into the same position that Haman had held before him. kind of the prime minister of the kingdom. I think there's some lessons that are important lessons for us as Christians also living in a pagan land. And again, like I said before, nowhere in this story does God's name have to be invoked. Nowhere does somebody say, I'm praying to God or I'm following God's laws to do this. They just lived their life on this different plane, upholding different standards, and people knew that there was something different about their life. But let me share with you 4 big lessons that I see in this story. The first one is this: all of history is his story. That's how you can remember whenever you see the word history, just put another S in there, change this. It's all God's story. Everything from bringing Xerxes to power in that Median and Persian kingdom, to Vashti's insolence to the king that caused her to be deposed, to the king not being able to sleep on a pivotal night. All of history is his story. And I love that phrase that Mordecai sent back to Esther that I think sums it up. He goes, who knows? Who knows? That maybe you haven't been brought to this royal position for such a time as this. Sometimes when we're in the midst of current events, it can be hard to see how is God going to make something out of this? What's going on here? And that's why we have to look back in history and see all of history is his story. He moves kings and emperors, and he even moves lowly servant girls into positions. He puts people where they need to be for such a time as this. And God hasn't changed. Today is still such a time as this. You might be living in the family that you're living in for such a time as this. You might be on the job that you're at for such a time as this. You might have crossed paths with somebody at one point in your life for such a time as this. All of history is his story. And when we're following him, we get to be a part of his story. The second big lesson that I think that we need to take away from this is I'm struck by how many times the word favor is used throughout this story. And what we can see is that God gives us favor, but then we have to continue to be obedient to God, and we win favor with other people. Time and time again, that word favor shows up in here. It starts off with Esther. Esther won Haggai's favor. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Esther went before the king and won his favor and approval more than any others. Later on, when Esther comes in before the king, it says that the king was pleased with her. The king regarded her with favor because of the way that she lived her life. Never want to take that for granted. Never want to leverage it for something that is our own personal gain. But if God's given me favor, how can I use it to leverage his kingdom? Remember what Jesus taught us to pray in his prayer? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. One of the ways that we bring God's kingdom to earth is with the favor that he gives us with people. And we use that in obedience to God to begin to change things. The third big lesson that comes out of this story is that God-following people do make a positive impact on their culture. And again, remember in this story, even without invoking the name of God, even without saying, I trust Jehovah, or in our modern language, I'm a Christian, even without saying that, these people make a positive impact on their culture. Now, remember I told you that when Haman wrote his law, that it said about the city of Susa that they were perplexed. When Haman wrote his law and sent it out, the next phrase is that the city of Susa broke into celebration. Even somebody that is using godly wisdom to make laws that can cause the people to rejoice. People that are not using godly wisdom can cause the people to groan and be perplexed and wonder what in the world is going on. God uses us to make a positive impact in our culture. Sometimes you won't see it. Because here's what might happen. there might be some people that you're around that you never realize that when you're around them, their vocabulary changes. Their lifestyle changes. There's some things that they don't do, some things that they won't say just because you're there. But you never notice that because the times that you're not there, they behave a different way. But you can make a positive impact on culture just by being who God created you to be. And you never have to invoke, hey, hold on, I'm a Christian, and we don't do that kind of stuff. There's a positive impact that takes place just because you're there. And finally, we see this especially in the life of Mordecai and Haman. Pride humiliates and destroys. Look at Haman. I mean, Haman, just every chance that he could, he was bragging about how he was all that. And yet he first is mortified, utterly humiliated, leading Mordecai around the city. Thus shall it be done to the man that the king delights to honor. And then ended up losing his life. Not only his life, his wife, his 12 sons, and all of the vast estate that he had accumulated, it all got distributed as well. He lost everything. But on the other hand, humility elevates. You know, I love the fact that in chapter 2 is where the story, the plot against the king is uncovered. And it ends in verse number 23. I love the fact that there's not a verse 24 there that's Mordecai going, man, how come I didn't get anything out of this? I saved the king's life. I didn't even get a thank you note. Or we don't even see in verse 24 him going back, hey, did you hear what I did? Did you check me out? He just said, I'm just going to go back to work. Same thing after Haman leads him through the town. When they get back, it just says Mordecai just went back to the gate. Just go back to work. And that humility caught the king's eye. And not only the king's eye, but there was this reputation that began to spread. Listen, let me just read a couple of verses for you. After Mordecai writes this law that allows the Jews to defend themselves, and the city is rejoicing, it says this: Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white. There was a large crown of gold on his head and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. By the way, that celebration now, the Jews, some 2,700 years later, still celebrate it in the month of Adar. It's called the celebration of Purim. They still celebrate that today. But it says, in every province and every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration. Now listen to this. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. This reverence, this awe for them. And it goes on to say this about Mordecai. All the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. And then here's the closing words of this story. It says, a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, which the king had raised up, are written in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Humility elevated him, and it glorified God. And the same principle holds in our life as well. Pride will humiliate us and destroy us, but humility will elevate us, and God will get the glory as a result of that. We have, as we do every week, we've got some questions that we want to make available for you to ponder. And I'd love for you to be able to just get together with somebody else or get together with a group of people and talk about some of these questions. But let me just share a couple of these with you. Number one, can I see God at work in both history and in current events? Can I see his fingerprints? Or am I getting nervous, wondering, how's God going to pull this out? Number two, am I leveraging God's favor in God-honoring ways? If God's given me favor on the job site, in my neighborhood, in maybe a position that I serve in my city or my township or something? Am I using it in a way to honor God? This third question, I think, even though this is well before his time, probably remember the story of when some people were trying to trick Jesus and they brought him a coin and said, what do you think, are we supposed to pay taxes? And he says, well, whose picture's on the coin? They said Caesar. He says, okay, give to Caesar what's Caesar, but give to God what's God's. Do you see Mordecai do that exact same thing 700 years before Jesus was even on the earth? He said, hey, it's immoral for them to try to murder the king, so I need to give to Caesar. I need to give to that king what is his. But it's also immoral for me to bow down and worship somebody other than God, so I'm going to not do that. I'm not going to give to Caesar what's God's. That's our question here. Do I know how to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's? And the final question goes with that last point. Am I appropriately humble? Am I appropriately humble when things happen in my life? Or do I can't wait to tell somebody. I can't wait to say, hey, you want to see what I did? Let me show off just a little bit. How can I use my humility in a way that God can get the glory from it? Fascinating story. God's name is not even mentioned, and yet we can look back and see his hand at work through the whole thing. And I pray that it's going to be the same way with our lives, that there might be times where we're like, is God doing something here? That we could have those eyes to see beyond the natural and say, God's still at work here, even if his name's not mentioned. And even if I don't come in and say, well, I'm a Christian and that's why I live this way, the people go, there's something different about your life. You're making a positive impact on your culture, a pagan culture, where you get to shine brightly. Let's pray. God, I remember the words in Philippians 2 that Paul said to that church, and I feel prompted to turn that into a prayer today. Paul said to them, in this crooked and depraved generation, may you live such beautiful lives that you shine like a star in these dark times. And God, I pray that for my friends today, that in a crooked and depraved generation, in a time where it seems like everybody is fighting against the things of God, running from his morality and his good plans, may we live such brilliant lives that we shine like a star in these dark times. May our lives stand out in stark contrast to people around us in the way that we work, in the way that we love our friends and family, and the way that we even love strangers, in the way that we forgive, in the way that we don't panic or become anxious because of what's happening with current events, but we are trusting and at peace that you are in control. God, in the way that we live, may it be so evident that we are yours and you are ours. Without us even having to say the words, may people just say there is something different about their lives. May we make a positive impact in the environments where you've placed us. And God, we want all the glory to go to you. So as we do things in this community, in our families, wherever you've placed us, that are things that cause people to rejoice. And there might come, as there did with Mordecai, a time of elevation, a time of promotion or recognition. But may we handle that with such humility, such grace, that the glory goes back to you. That we just simply say, I'm just God's servant, doing what he's called me to do. And then just as we saw in those closing words about Mordecai's life, that his influence was felt throughout that entire province. Because that he looked out for the welfare of people. May that be said about our lives as well. May our influence and our impact on this culture begin to expand and grow and brighten, and may all the glory go to you, God, we pray. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Amen. God bless you, friends. Thanks for being here today. Make sure on the way out, grab one of those sheets with those application questions on them. At a bare minimum, ponder them yourselves, but try and get together with somebody. Talk about it. Say, how can we live this out in our lives? And God will be honored by that. I love you. Have a wonderful week.